Okay, so I'll start. I present the event that we are hosting today. I'm Matteo Scardovelli. I am talking in behalf of Centro Camuno di Studi Preistorici, which is a research center that is located in Val Camonica, Italy, one of the most beautiful areas for rock art in Italy. In terms, really, it's a valley. For those of you who have never been there, it's a valley where you can find thousands, literally thousands of signs, any kind of signs, anthropomorphs and animal and abstract, everything. Starting from the end of Paleolithic till Roman period until Middle Ages and till very recently. So it covers really thousands of years also of history of population. So talking about contact rock art, Val Camonica is also very interesting because at some point you see how it changes when there is, for example, the Etruscan alphabet that arrives, and there are the Romans that arrive, when there is the, well, it's not the same, of course, but you can really see how it changes with the Italian histories, you know, going on, the Celts and the Romans and all sort of influences. So today we are very glad and happy to have with us Sam Challis, that I had the great honor to meet in person in 2012 when I went to visit the RARI, which is the Rock Art Institute Research at the WITS, which is the University of the Witwatersrand in Johannesburg, South Africa. It had been a very very enjoyable visit that I did, because I also had the honor of going with Dr. Challis, visiting the rock art of the Drakensberg area and the greater area, South African rock art made by the Sun. And it had been really interesting because also there, the rock art that you have, it's magnificent. Much more color, because it's a lot painted than the Val Camonica, which is mainly engravings. He's today the head of the RARI, in fact, of this research institute. His main interests are in rock art, of course, archaeology, South African rock art in particular, San Bushman rock art, and the particular aspects that he investigated and that he is presenting today is a transformation, contact, colonial and historical processes. So we are very glad that today he will be talking about the title of his presentation is The Effects of Contact in the Rock Art of Southern Africa. So a great welcome to Sam Challis.
Thank you very much, Matteo. I'm going to try to share my screen now.
Yes.
Hopefully this works for everybody.
Yes. Of course, I didn't say any of you that is following the conversation, you're more than welcome to comment on Facebook, and if you want to ask some questions to Sam Challis, he will be happy to answer them, I guess. And so feel free to interact. So Sam.
I'll be very happy to answer any questions at all.
Yes, all right.
Thanks very much for the very kind introduction, and I also remember very fondly our trip in 2012.
All right. Sorry.
Thanks for the very kind introduction, and I think we need to mute.
Yeah, I'm fine. Go ahead.
Okay, fantastic. So, yes, as Matteo said, I'm now the head of the Rock Art Research Institute at WITS. And before proceeding, I should point out that any of the names that I use for any particular identity of people, because of course we're going to be talking about multiple groups, whether you like to call them ethnicities or groups or whatever, or language groups, and I particularly reject any pejorative associations, of course, with any of these names. So very often in our research, we use interchangeably the words San and Bushman, because in the Cape in Southern Africa today, the word San is the more popular, but of course it can have and has historically had negative and pejorative connotations. It came to mean vagabond or tramp, or somebody who's a hanger-on, or somebody who doesn't own animals or doesn't own livestock, that sort of thing. And in the end, it came to it was synonymous with robbery and thief. The word thief was interchangeable with San. Nowadays, in the Kalahari, where San people still live today, they tend to favor the word Bushman. They call themselves Bushmen. They say, we are Bushmen. So it's a politically very sensitive nomenclature either way. And the same goes for quay and quay or quequen, and also with Isiantu and Bantu language speakers as well. So that's just very important to point out.
Yeah, you did well. Thank you very much.
Okay. Now, moving on swiftly, if I had to get one particular point across before we go any further, and if I had to get one particular point across, what we're looking at is change over roughly a 2,000-year period. Contact between the autochthonous, indigenous hunter-gatherers and outsiders began roughly about 2,000 years ago. Of course, there was contact between hunter-gatherer groups, but that's not the same thing as contact with other language group speakers or other economies, particularly. And the effect after this 2,000 years worth of contact with pastoralists, contact with African farmers, contact with Europeans, is that the rock art changes considerably. But it's actually much more complicated than it seems at first glance. So on the left here in picture A, you have what we might refer to as a traditional, something from the traditional corpus, the traditional body of San rock art. This is what we would call a shaded polychrome, many colors, polychromatic eland antelope. The eland antelope is the largest of all antelope, and it's larger than most. It's larger than most deer as well. Of course, if you were thinking in European terms, these animals weigh up to 1 ton, and they stand about 6 foot high at the shoulder. So they're absolutely enormous creatures, and they were a religious symbol. So I always liken it to looking at this rock art is like walking into a European church. If you're not of the Christian faith or don't have a Christian cultural background, you might walk into a church and see in the stained glass window, the colored window in the pictures, a man standing there with a sheep. He's got a little baby sheep, a lamb, under his arm, and a shepherd's stick. And if you're not from within the culture, or you don't have an understanding of the culture, you might think, oh, this society must have liked to eat sheep. But somebody from within the culture would say, no, that's absolutely not what it's at all. That's the Lamb of God. That is a symbol of X, Y, and Z. And so when we turn to the San rock art, we're talking about a religious art. We're not talking about sympathetic hunting magic, unless it is in particularly specific terms from within the San religious idiom. We're not talking about images of everyday life. We're not talking about a record of a narrative of something that they saw, something that they've seen. Anything prosaic or anything pedestrian like that, you can chuck it out the window, forget it. And the reason we can be so confident about this is that in the 1960s and 70s, South African scholars, notably Patricia Vinicum and David Lewis Williams turned around and said, hey, hang on a minute. We're not getting anywhere with counting these things and quantifying them with a new archaeology. Let us instead turn to the ethnographic, the anthropological information, which is right here, which they had ready to hand. From the 19th century, from scholars making records of San religious thought, and let us also use modern Kalahari anthropological studies, which had begun properly in the 1950s, and see if we can match the two, see if we can illuminate the rock art. And lo and behold, suddenly, bang, it all happened. And Lewis Williams is the guy who's credited with, if you like, cracking the code, like Champollion with the Rosetta Stone. And so it turns out that all of this stuff is religious. Having said that, over 2,000 years of contact with other people, the religious ideas change, the religious beliefs change, the method of execution changes, as you might expect when different groups of people come together. And so on the left, you have the traditional corpus, shaded polychrome eland, and on the right, you have something that until recently would have been dismissed as bad. You know, that's bad art, people used to say. And of course, nowadays, we wouldn't say anything like that. It's different, but why is it different? One of the main reasons is the breakup of society. So there is a deterioration in society, while people, particularly under colonial rule, are becoming decimated, are becoming fragmented. Not only that, but religious practice is changing, but also the access to pigments, and the access to pigments is being restricted. So the more that the San are being confined to, for example, the deserts or the mountains, so too does their access to trade networks, and networks of both things like pigment. The good pigment comes from the basalt layers right up at the top of the Maluti Drakensberg. But also ideas, and the flow of ideas is also being restricted. And so we're going to hopefully be touching on a few things like that. But I'm also going to be touching on what happens to the groups of people themselves when they meet one another. And it's not just the ideas that change, but cultures change, and gene flow has quite a lot to do with it as well. This is an extremely oversimplified version of what happens over these 2,000 years. Around about 3,000 years ago, up at the very top of the yellow arrow in the northern end of the Kalahari Desert there, San language speakers, hunter-gatherers, come into contact with East African pastoralists, so people that you might imagine in your mind's eye as being like the Maasai of Kenya. Mm-hmm. Those sorts of people, African herders, pastoralists with sheep and cattle and goats, with iron and pottery, ceramics, and a pastoral nomadic way of life. And these hunter-gatherers take on, by various means and in various ways, they take on all of these items of material culture and animals, and also cultural beliefs, and genes as well are mixed, and they become something new. So they are the quay language is actually the language of hunter-gatherers, and there are still quay speakers who are hunter-gatherers there today, who are the descendants of people who did not make the change over to pastoralism. So you can see it's already starting to get quite complicated.
Yeah.
These folks migrate again by various means and for various reasons. I'm not going to go into all the details of how and why people move around the world, but they move all over the place. But one of their movements is certainly southwards, And it is these people that the Portuguese first meet when they get to the Cape in the 1400s. And the Portuguese think, hey, this is fantastic. These people have livestock. They have cattle and sheep and goats and pottery. And so they come ashore and they trade with them. And of course, that's one of the reasons why the Cape becomes a trading post and a stopping off point for Europeans trying to reach the East Indies. And hence that the colonial history of South Africa commences. The red arrow indicates African farmers. So the people that you might today associate with the vast majority of the population: Zulu speakers, Xhosa speakers, Sotho speakers, Tswana, etc., etc. So these are farmers, agro-pastoralists who have crops and animals and iron and pottery, etc., etc., etc. Coming down the East African coastline. There should also be another arrow coming down the West African coastline, but that would complicate matters a bit too much, and down the middle as well. But the main drive is down the East African coastline, and you can see the map shows the carrying capacity. So it's a livestock carrying capacity, because we're in the dark grey colour there is the most rainfall, and thus also the most edible pasture for animals. And so that the dark grey ends up being the most contested areas. But the migration of Isintu or Bantu, Ntu just means people. So it's people speakers if you translate it to literally, but Isintu language speakers. So the same language group as people in East Africa, West Africa, all the way up to Senegal. More in very, very general terms, reach this river down here at the bottom, the Great Fish River, where the summer rainfall zone meets the winter rainfall zone. And because they're crops, the African crops, sorghum and millet, won't grow in the winter rainfall zone, that is where their migration stops. Except for a very few who drop crops and become pastoralists and venture a little bit beyond the Great Fish River and up into the Karoo Desert here. So certain Xhosa speakers don't concentrate on crops, and then they migrate a little bit further north, as Sotho speakers and Tswana speakers are coming down this way. If you can see my cursor there. So again, this is way oversimplified. It's far too simple. But for general purposes, if you're not familiar with the subcontinent and the peopling of the subcontinent, this is just a very, very basic sort of overview. And that migration, people crossed the Limpopo here about 2,000 years ago. So in many ways, it's contemporaneous with this migration. The Khoi migration, I should say, is an incredibly complex one. First, sheep seem to change hands from one person to another, to another, to another. And so there's actually a diffusion of sheep. And then only 1,000 years later, so 1,000 years ago, do actual Khoi speakers arrive. So this is more, the yellow arrow is more an indication of pastoralism arriving than it is the people who you associate with it later. So that's the work of Karim Sada has shown that pastoralism arrived in two waves. Firstly, by diffusion of these items like sheep and goats from one person to another amongst hunter-gatherers. And then 1,000 years later, the actual full Khoi speakers arrive with cattle. The little blue things, I tried to make them into the shape of boats because that is, of course, how Europeans arrived. So the Europeans, like the Portuguese and the Dutch and the French and the British, and then the French again, and then the Dutch, and then the British again, come to the Cape and start trying to take over. And of course, it starts down in Cape Town here with the first settlement, the permanent settlement of the Dutch, who by this time are setting up their colonial establishments in the Far East, in the East Indies, Indonesia. And they're also bringing in unfree labor, otherwise referred to as slaves. And there are many, many, many of these from Indonesia, from Sri Lanka, later on under British rule, from India, and there's this part of the world, quite literally in the most technical sense, the local population becomes creolized. It's a Creole culture, such as you would find in the southern states of America, of the US, and in the Caribbean. And that's quite important for our story, because these Creole people, who today refer to themselves as colored, although that is also a contested term, some of them say, no, we're actually Khoisan descendants. So, of course, we're rejecting anything pejorative there. Again, we don't wish to offend anyone at all. But for the most part, people refer to themselves as colored in that part of the world because of their creolized and mixed ethnic descent. African, European, Indonesian, Malay, Chinese, Indian, all mixed together, and of course, crucially, mixed with the local quay speaker and San speaker, hunter-gatherer San speaker people as well. So it's a very, very, very mixed population in the Cape. And as that spreads, so too the situation becomes even more complicated. But to artificially essentialize, I use these wonderful drawings of Samuel Daniel, who was in the Cape between 1799 and 1802. And he made these fantastic, but they're idealized. They're sort of, well, what I would normally refer to when I'm talking to my students, I say Greco-Roman. I'm sure you know what I mean. This sort of idealized physique. But a lot of the early travelers were, of course, they marveled at the physique of the indigenous people, and that's been critiqued and criticized all the way there and back again since. So this is what he thought that the San hunter-gatherers looked like, and they have arrows there in their headdresses, and that they only ever put arrows in their headdress when they were getting ready to fight. They wanted quick access to their poisoned arrows. And their enemies, their adversaries, were very, very, very scared of these poisoned arrows, because if you even got a scratch from one of these, you might be dead within 20 minutes or an hour. So yeah, these are it's pretty serious stuff. And these folks managed to hold up the great trek of the Afrikaner farmers into the hinterland by a good 50 to 100 years in some places, with very, very fierce resistance. Quay pastoralists, again, genetically very, very similar to the San hunter-gatherers in many ways, but culturally quite different altogether. Having, as I said, taken all of these accoutrements with domestic livestock. You can see dogs there, but they were nomadic, and they used to use these oxen to move house from one place to another. Again, but this is an artificially essentialized ethnic identity. Of course, we're not talking about people necessarily fitting into boxes or groups like that. And then Samuel Daniel again doing these idealized, almost like Greco-Roman warrior physique with the Xhosa warriors. The Xhosa nation, the most famous of historical figure, of course, from the Xhosa nation was Nelson Mandela. So this is Nelson Mandela, who you may have heard of, ethnic group, or at least language group, and the second most populous of the Isintu language speaking groups in the subcontinent, and spread over a much wider area than anybody else. And it includes many, many, many clans today. So it's a vast nation of people. I mean, if you were talking about Europe, you might say something like, the Etruscans or the Gauls or something like that, or or Germanic language speakers. You know, there's a lot of these guys.
Yeah.
And the even more populous language speaking group is, of course, the Zulu language speaking group, whom everybody has heard, largely owing to their defeat of the British in 1879 at the Battle of Isandlwana. That's when the Zulu really made it famous in the history books, because the British couldn't believe that they could be defeated. And then there spirals out a whole history of colonial ups and downs there. And these groups were, of course, largely subjugated terribly under colonial rule. And then that subjugation under colonial rule was made formal in 1949 under the apartheid regime. And therein lies the story of modern South Africa, and why even today it's such a violent and contested country. But we have lots of different rock arts in the subcontinent. On the right, you can see something that looks a little bit more like traditional quay speaker art, performed with a finger, and we think performed at initiation ceremonies. On the left, we have something else, which is also performed with the finger, and probably also performed by quay speakers, but as you can see, these are people riding horses during the process of colonization, with depicting the horses and guns that are introduced by colonists. Here we have a sacrifice of a bull. It's painted in a traditional San fine line technique. So using a brush, we would normally associate that with the hunter-gatherers, and that's not always necessarily the case at all. It's a rule of thumb. It's a very broad generalization. But something that we can see here is you can see a sort of crescent-shaped axe. Here is the handle of the axe. It has an attachment here in iron. It's hafted with iron, and is an enormous blade. And the red paint has been enhanced. This enhancement was made by Jeremy Holman. In fact, he found the site and he traced it beautifully, and then made a digital rendering of it, and he's enhanced it so that we can see. And this is a bull being sacrificed, but it is all in connection with, because of course the bull is a domestic animal, with the first fruits springtime ritual of Isintu, in this part of the world, Zulu speaking African farmers. And so what we're seeing here really is evidence of an interaction between hunter-gatherers with their hunter-gatherer fine line artistic tradition, depicting something that is happening within farmer society. And so one of the very strong things that we see coming through with this art in this subcontinent is this reverence for the Aboriginal people. There's a reverence amongst farmers and a reverence amongst pastoralists for the original inhabitants. So at the same time as coming into the country and taking all of the good pasture and taking all of the good land and making sure that the San have to retreat into the mountains and the deserts, there is at the same time an absolute reverence for their magical and medicinal capabilities. They obviously are very closely connected to the land, and they know what absolutely every single plant, the properties of every plant and animal medicine in the subcontinent, which and traditions vary from one group to another, of course. And so incoming farmers and incoming pastoralists from further north in Africa arrive, and over 2 millennia adopt a lot of the both in practical terms, the medicinal practices, but they're inseparable from religious practices. So medicinal healing practices are inseparable from religious practice among all of these groups. And so this is not a depiction made by somebody who observed a ritual taking place. This is far more likely to be a ritual that is being taken part in by the hunter-gatherers. So the hunter-gatherers will be part of this first fruits sacrifice that ensures the growing of the crops for the farmers for the coming year. The farmers used to go to the San to have rain made for them. So rain making was actually a commodity. So if you're an outsider like Matteo and I, we're from Europe and we're from outside of these cultures, it's often very difficult to understand something like rainmaking as being it's not that we can't understand the belief, it's that we wouldn't necessarily think of it immediately as being a commodity that you could trade, you could bargain. And so farmers, Zulu-speaking farmers, we know, used to go to the San in the Drakensberg Mountains and ask for rain to be made for them to ensure the success of the crops for the next year. And the San would ask for payment in cattle. And so they would be paid in cattle. And we have a record of them asking for payment in black cattle. They said, no, we would like black cattle because black is the color of the rain clouds. Over time, I should have started with that one. The San have a belief that rain, rivers, water holes, mist, anything that comprises water, the clouds themselves, are all manifestations of quay, and quay is the water, and quay is the rain. It's a difficult quantity. It's a difficult entity to quantify or to name or to define. But quay, for us, we would say this is a deity. It's a rain deity, but it takes many, many different forms. And so one of the forms that quay can take is that of an animal, of a beast. But it can take many other forms. So quay can also appear as an eland antelope. As we saw the eland antelope earlier, that can also be a manifestation of the rain itself. And here we see one such thing. And so very often in the paintings, you'll see these composites of things that look a little bit like a hippo, a little bit like a warthog, a little bit like a giant buffalo, a little bit like something with tusks or teeth, or very often elephant characteristics as well. But almost always you will see them being approached or dealt with by human figures approaching these animals and doing things with them or doing things to them. And here we can see people with a rope tied to the nose of this smaller rain animal, and they're running along with it, because it is the belief that you need to enter the spirit world in order to capture the rain. This is how you make rain. You have to go into the spirit world in order to capture it. And then whilst you're in the spirit world, you lead the animal across the sky and you cut the animal so that its blood will fall as rain. The rain animal's blood is the rain. And this is a belief that we think may go back certainly many hundreds of years, maybe millennia. But another animal that that the rain can take the form of is that of a giant snake. And it just so happens that African pastoralists and African farmers have similar sets of beliefs in which they also believe that water is connected with snakes, and that in certain places, particularly in water holes or particularly in deep pools in rivers, there exists a large snake that is an incredibly dangerous thing, and that this is a manifestation of the water itself. And so it doesn't take an enormous leap of the imagination to think about what must have happened when incoming African pastoralists and incoming African farmers met the San and started to talk about their beliefs and negotiate not only space on the landscape, but negotiate space in a ritual sense as well. And the incoming, the indigenous hunter-gatherers must have been thinking of ways in which to interact with the newcomers. And so one of those was to say, you know, hey, you know, we can actually make rain. And so the rock art, we think, takes a little bit of a shift. It isn't that snakes were absent from San rock art before, but certainly in the later layers of paintings, if we look at the superpositioning, the paintings that are most often on top often depict these large snakes being captured. And you can see here, these people on the right are leading this very large coiling snake with a line to its nose. There's its nose and there's a line, just like the animal here had a line to its nose. And so, whereas this one is bovid, this one is serpentine. But of course, it's not a real snake, of course, not something that you and I would say was real, but it is something that locals in this locality, in this place, would say is very much real. And they warn you not to go down to the river because this snake is in there, even today. Even now that there are no longer any, at least culturally, any San left in this particular area. Only San descendants, and that's the point. The point is that the San descendants have carried this on. And so we go to these areas like very rural Lesotho or the Maluti Drakensberg, and we talk to people in rural areas, and we're still able to derive a lot of information pertaining to these things. And so here you can see people clapping. So the way in which you access the spirit world, you may be familiar with. If you're rock art enthusiasts, you might very well already be familiar with the work of David Lewis Williams. And it's not his own made up shamanic shamania, as some people like to call it. It's all very firmly rooted in San a religious belief and ritual practice. So today in the Kalahari, people dance around a fire all night long until they fall in unconscious in a trance, and they go into what they're experiencing is their spirit leaving their body through a hole in the top of their head, and they go off into the spirit world to undertake these tasks. And you see the same thing happening in parts of Siberia, and you see the same thing happening in North and South America, and anyway, where you have similar religious cosmologies. Of course, they're all very widely different, but the process of achieving this state is very often the same, because our physiogeny is the same and our neural networking is the same. And so here you see people clapping in the dance and falling over and bleeding from the nose. The bleeding from the nose, as you can see here, somebody's bleeding from the nose there, somebody's bleeding from the nose there. This comes from the hyperventilation, from breathing in and out very, very quickly in the dance. And that induces that hyperventilation, but also hemorrhaging in the nose. And so you get the nose bleeding. So it's seen as a symbol of going into the spirit world. And so post-contact, we see a lot more snakes and people approaching snakes and dealing with snakes. So you have these non-real things. So you have a snake covered in spines, with tusks coming out of its nose. Remember this rain animal with the tusks coming out of its nose here, sort of non-real tusks. This one even has 3 of them. You have tusks coming out of the nose of the snake, and the snake is also bleeding from the nose, as the man is somehow dealing with it, probably in order to placate it, in order to then catch this thing and make rain with it. And these beliefs are still held in great part today. You can go just about anywhere in rural South Africa and find Isangoma, Dingaka, Amadricha, in the Xhosa-speaking world, and all of these ritual specialists, diviners from the African, with African cultural backgrounds, over the course of 2 millennia, adopted an enormous amount of beliefs that you won't find anywhere else in Africa. And it's as a direct result of contact with the San. So the Flyswitch is here, this man holding a Flyswitch. This is something that you would only see at the San trance dances. And you can see San people dancing like Bushmen in the Kalahari today, dancing with these Flyswitches. And they're actually used to combat spirits of the dead who also come to the dances and bring sickness. And many of the beliefs that you find today in many of these communities still hold, and we can see evidence of them having worked their way into mixed society during the process of contact and colonization. And one of the big clues that we are able to follow up on is this one of the baboon. So you can see here's a tracing that I made, and I did a redrawing in pen and ink just to make it clearer, because the original is very faded. But of course, here's somebody on the left riding a horse, and horses only reached this part of the world in roughly the 1830s, it's quite late, galloping alongside an enormous baboon. But this isn't a baboon hunt. The enormous baboon is symbolic of something. And it just so happened that the beliefs that pertain to baboons were beliefs which were held by all three of those essentialized groups. So San speakers, quay speakers, African farmers. They all, after a process of contact of 2 millennia, they all, by the time of colonization at least, shared beliefs pertaining to the baboon and what the baboon means and what the baboon does. And it's connected with this plant. The San speakers say that this plant, if you dig up a piece of the root and use it against your enemies will be tied up. And isiXhosa speakers, so that's Nelson Mandela, Thabo Mbeki, to those of you who don't know who the Xhosa nation are. Xhosa speakers call this plant umabope. You may even have some of it in your garden. It's just Plumbago auriculata. But umabope loosely translates as the thing that ties up, the thing that binds. And if you use it against your enemies, they will be incapacitated. They will be rooted to the spot and unable to move. They might even be temporarily blinded, or they may just fall into a stupor and forget. That's the Latin name for it. And these are the red roots. Now, the baboon is said to keep a little piece of this root in its left cheek pouch. It doesn't eat it, it doesn't swallow it, it just keeps it there. And the San speakers say that it is the root that tells the baboon about approaching danger. The baboon will always see you first. The baboon will always see you coming before you see it. And I've been in the bush many, many, many times, and the baboons are always aware of you long time before you've seen them. They start barking when you're 2 kilometers away. They've seen you already. And they're you can't catch them. And even if you did want to catch one, if they say if you shoot your bow and arrow at it, it will just catch the arrow and throw it back at you. And so people have co-opted this medicine, and it was used in a formal way by the Xhosa warriors when they were running into battle. And the belief was that projectiles, whether they be arrows or spears or bullets, would go around you, and that the bullets of the colonists' muskets would turn to water. And this stuff is used still today all over Southern Africa. And the belief in it is very, very, very strong. And it can also be misappropriated and used by thieves. So thieves will come to your house, and with the use of this medicine, make you fall asleep, or that make themselves invisible, or that you will just be tied to the spot and unable to move while they take all of your animals or all your belongings and leave, and you won't be able to do anything about it. And I have it on good authority that this is still used today as well. And so you can imagine during colonial times, when the entire subcontinent was becoming very violent and resistance fighting was reaching its peak, we end up with groups coming out of the Cape, people who had been for a couple of 100 years subject to unfree labor, slavery, or indentured labor once the slavery rules changed, escaping, running away, and taking horses and guns with them. So if you can imagine, I always say to people, if people are sort of struggling to picture what's going on, we're talking about pirates of the Caribbean. If you can imagine pirates of the Caribbean on land, these are your guys. And so they're taking horses, taking muskets, alcohol, and escaping. And if you escape, you have to make sure that you escape a long way away, because you don't want to be caught again. You might be hanged or whatever it is. And in order to effect that escape, and in order to protect yourself on these expeditions, it's very likely that the religious belief that this baboon magic and baboon medicine will help you. And we have up in the mountains many examples of dance images of people dancing and changing into baboons. So what they're doing is they're summoning the power of this animal from all around them. So the women's job is to clap and sing the songs of the animals, and so it's summoning the essence of particular animals to the dance. And the men who are dancing around the fire absorb the essence of that animal into themselves, and with that power, they're able to affect the leap into the spirit world. And so here we have people changing into baboons. There's one person here, there's one sitting on the left here holding his nose because he's probably bleeding from the nose. It's a very common posture in the dances. And we see horses entering. So we know that these paintings are being made in the 19th century after the arrival of horses, or after horses get into the hands of the indigenes in a big way. And we can tie all of these events to specific points in time. We can tie these phenomena to specific events rather. And so there are various very important events during the colonial era. One is the defeat of Ndlambe. The Ndlambe's defeat, and Ngrika the Ngrika have to give up what then becomes known as the ceded territory. And it's an enormous area in the Eastern Cape, wherein lie these mountains called the Winterberg Mountains. And we think this is one of the very first places where people who are coming from groups that have been broken up start to reform. So San groups who have been systematically, I mean, there's the remnants of the San genocide, if you like, have been systematically removed from the countryside over the preceding 100 years or so by colonial farmers, and then the remnants of destroyed groups of Xhosa speakers and quay speakers start to come together in these refugia, in refuge points high up in these mountains. And it is here that we start to see the first signs that the rock art changes and the incorporation of animals that are associated with resistance. and one of those animals is of course the baboon. So in these little valleys, we just recently found a whole bunch of new rock art sites. That's my master's student, honor student, Nduduzi Maseko, pointing out a painting where we have, on top of the traditional corpus, we have more roughly painted eland, and then we start to get domestic livestock painted on top, and then later on we start to see the incorporation of people riding horses, people with fat-tailed sheep, people with cattle, and then the incorporation of this animal, the baboon. So this one is finger painted. And for a long time, we couldn't figure out why suddenly you would skip from brush painted to finger painted, sometimes in the same shelter. And it's only when you start to look at the history books that you realize, these renegade groups of pirates are comprised of people from all sorts of different walks of life. So you will have Khoi speakers, you will have Nguni speakers, Bantu speaking people. There were Europeans who were on the run from the law. There were people who had escaped prison. There were military deserters. The British annals from the 1790s through to about the 1850s are just littered with names of people who'd run away from military duty and just run into the escaped into the hinterland across the frontier and joined, very often joining these groups, bringing horses and guns and alcohol with them, pirates. And so we have these finger paintings. Now the finger paintings may be coming from all sorts of influences. There may be all sorts of reasons why somebody might want to paint with the finger. Maybe it is coming out of the quay speaking tradition of painting with a finger. Maybe it's just somebody who doesn't want to paint with a brush, who is from a completely different walk of life. And we have plenty of instances where colonial farmers have recorded groups of runaway slaves on their farms. You have to remember that the farms are absolutely enormous. So there's one man called Pringle who says, no, I have a group of runaway slaves living in a rock shelter on my farm, and they regularly steal my livestock. And so here we have finger paintings of people on horseback. That's a very, very faded one, but I think you can see that sort of a straight line, very, very simply painted with a finger. And here we have people in colonial dress. So you can see the hoop skirts and the European posture with hands on hips, and mixed in with traditional Khoi imagery. And then again, we have people on horseback with guns. And then we get the incorporation of the baboon. Over here, you can see a horse and then a baboon underneath in black, painted quite fine line, but quite quickly with a rough brush. And so we have the incorporation of all of this imagery coming together in this area down here, which is on the Eastern Cape frontier. And these groups are referred to in the 19th century as quote unquote Bushmen, Hottentots, and runaway slaves. That is to say, San speakers, quay speakers, and these runaway slaves who are already a Creole and people ancestral to what later becomes the nation of colored people who exist today all over Southern Africa, but particularly in the Western Cape, of course, who are of mixed ancestry and very proud of their mixed ancestry and of their traditions that have evolved over the last couple of thousand years. The runaway slaves, some of them are from, some of them are already a Creolized individuals of multiple lines of descent, and some of them are Malagasys from Madagascar, some are Mozambicans, some of them are West Africans, some of them are from Indonesia, and they're all coming together in a sort of constantly evolving and a situation that's constantly giving birth to itself, if you like, and European military deserters joining these groups as well. And they find refuge in the the southeastern mountains. So they're coming from here. They're forming on the Eastern Cape frontier between 1795 and 1835. It looks too specific, but this is what the colonial written. If the colonial written history is good for anything, it's good for this sort of thing. But what we are able to do is inform the colonial history in a much more rich fashion by holding up a mirror to it, and there we get this fantastic reverse gaze, which is the indigenous archive looking back on the colonial process during this time of resistance. Because of course, it used to be thought that these people were just inveterate thieves and they couldn't help themselves, and they had no other instinct but to take the farmers' animals. But of course, now we realize that these were acts of resistance. This was a very, very deliberate guerrilla warfare that was being waged from the mountains. And very often a single farmer could lose 300 cattle in one night and be bankrupt and have to return to the Cape, or go and live with relatives, or get back on a boat and go back to Europe, or whatever their options were. And so it was a very effective method of resistance fighting. And another misconception that we can dispel is that the San and these mixed groups of raiders who were actively involved in this guerrilla fighting were somehow incapable of telling the difference between domestic stock and wild animals. That's a very, very popular colonial and apartheid era mythology, is that the indigenes they didn't know the difference between they took the farmers' cows because they thought they were antelope or some nonsense like that. And of course, not only did they know exactly what they were doing, but part of their membership in these creolized groups was already very much from a pastoralist background. So there were quay-speaking pastoralists in there. There were Isintu African farmers in there. There were European runaways in there as well. And so they knew exactly what they were doing. But not just that, but these domestic animals also start to make their way into a religious belief. But it is not as simple as the domestic animals making their way into San belief. It is a new religious makeup altogether. The religious beliefs of hunter-gatherers are becoming mixed with the religious beliefs of farmers over the preceding 2 millennia already. And now with this sort of accelerated rate of cultural creolization, you start to get new forms of religion popping up all over the place. And one of which is this incorporation of the horse. And so we see these horses with streamer-like tails, and people in the spirit world now in a trance state floating along. But you can see the European wide-brimmed hat there. So we're also able to dispel the mythology that in these images a picture of a person on a horse wearing a hat is a depiction of a European person. Of course, everybody by this point has access to horses and hats. You know, the hats are freely available. They don't signify Europeans. They do signify that the Europeans have arrived, but they're not necessarily pictures of Europeans. And so it's very important to note that these are images being made by people of themselves. These are the concerns of the indigenes. There's not a mirror being held up to us, the European invaders. And it was a very popular colonial construct and an apartheid era construct where people would see these images of people on horses wearing hats, and they'd say, "Oh, look, they're painting us." You know, they were overawed, or they were just so impressed by us that they just had to make a record of it somehow. And I think in rock art studies in general, we suffer from this delusion. Also, it's a trap. It's a trap that we fall into very regularly. When we see a depiction of something, we automatically think that these are the local artists depicting the other, depicting something new coming in. Whereas in this instance, it's very clear, and it's backed up by the historical archive. It's backed up by the religious beliefs that we have access to. This has got nothing to do with the colonists, other than the fact that the subject matter is horses and hats, and these fantastic trance dance scenes, which show a very, very heavy San influence, but they're not 100% San. And when we look to the modern Isin2 language speakers, we see the upshot of these beliefs in baboons. All three of these diviners are wearing baboon skin caps, and those baboon skin caps denote their attachment to their spirit guide. So these people will have twasid, they will have gone underwater into the spirit world, and they have met with their ancestors, and they would have met with their spirit animal. And for these particular individuals in these pictures, their spirit animal is the baboon, and it's a very, very, very powerful animal used for good. So the white beads denote everything that is good about the ancestors. The ancestors are the apogee of everything that is right and proper. But the baboon can also be misappropriated by witches, and it's very often associated with witchcraft. A lot of European observers, outsiders, think that that is all it is, but it of course isn't. The wild and natural baboon is a fantastic thing and a very powerful animal that is used for good. But among witches, apparently, the baboon is used for evil purposes. And so, this is the book Amaglicha. By the way, the GQ is the click that comes from the San language, and it's a direct borrowing. The San traditional healers were called Qicha, and the Amakosa had so much contact with the San over the preceding millennia that they did away with their word for doctor, which is Sangoma, and they adopted the word of the San for their traditional healers. So much of their religious practice is based in the hunter-gatherer religion. And these are initiates, and the one in the middle is holding a stick of the umabope, the plumbago, as an item of protection. This stick will keep the initiate protected from evil spirits. Here's a sketch from somebody's description of a witch riding backwards on one of these baboons. It's the witch's familiar, and this witch is riding backwards and going around doing evil things. And so we think that the people who were on baboon power were doing so in a good way to protect themselves, but also it was a way of telling other groups around them, because there was so much fighting from between one group and another, that they had this very, very powerful medicine, but they were also not to be messed with and left alone. And we also see in the items of material culture coming into the rock art that is otherwise San. So we have these things that otherwise would be called San trance dances, but there's so much emphasis on African farmer material culture, the fighting sticks, the knobkiris, the double feathered headdresses. And then if I was to zoom out from these two particular dancers, we would see horses and cows on either side. So we know exactly when it was painted. It was painted in the 19th century. And it was the result of this creolization of cultural practices and beliefs. And we have these marvelous depictions of people with gallbladders in the hair. Now, gallbladders are part of the materia medica of the diviners. So the diviners will make a sacrifice of a sheep or of a goat, and they will take the bladder of the sheep and goat and inflate that. And so that's what this Qicha diviner has in their headdress. And that's what we see in these images, people bending forward, bleeding from the nose, holding on to this farmer accoutrement, the fighting sticks that you associate with Zulu speakers, Sotho speakers, Xhosa speakers, but in a very much San ritual context. And here they are capturing one of these rain animals. So these are people with mixed material culture, farmer and pastoralist material culture in a San fine line context, capturing the rain bull. And a little bit like the San used to use the snake in order to reach out and communicate to farmer society, so too often did the bovid rain animal become even more bovid and much more like a cow. And so we have these kind of bull figures being led by the nose, and in order to make rain. Here's someone else with bladders in the hair, gallbladders. And another phenomenon that I just wanted to point out before I wrap up. Here's somebody with gallbladders in the hair, more gallbladders in the hair, more gallbladders in the hair. They're holding onto these long sticks with it. So there's a lot of farmer material culture, and then suddenly we have the appearance of women. So there's a gendered aspect to this 19th century contact rock art, whereby usually the ritual sphere it was had been if not entirely, then mostly confined to the male sphere of influence, shall we say. There's a marked increase in the 19th century of female figures coming into the rock art. And it's a result of several factors. One of which is there are more people of farmer descent coming into these communities and mixing and becoming becoming part of this Creole formation of new societies up in the mountains, and that is something that's bringing women into this ritual sphere. But also we can see that something that's coming out of the African diviner tradition is that once you become a ritual specialist, ikricha or sangoma, you become something new, something ambiguous. So once you've gone underwater and you've met with the ancestors and you're reborn, and so you will often find men wearing skirts and women holding men's accoutrements. So here's a spear and the knobkiri and the flyswitch, which ordinarily, as a woman, she wouldn't be able to hold. And so the ritual specialists are themselves quite ambiguous and difficult to attribute or to put in a box. And that's part of their power, of course, is that they can transcend these boundaries. And so in the rock art, we start to see women coming in. And here we have women with the knobkiris holding spears. And you can see the two at the front here holding these little sticks, which until recently, before we actually started investigating what plant medicines were likely to be being utilized, we just thought were either incomplete paintings or maybe the paintbrush slipped or something, or we didn't have any idea why somebody would be holding onto a little stick like this. But these are very likely to be umabope, or the roots that protect initiates while they're becoming ritual specialists, and the root that is used to protect raiders when they go on these raiding expeditions to take livestock as part of this guerrilla warfare. So here we have all these scenes where horses are coming in. We've got lots and lots of women holding spears. We know that they have to be ritual specialists because otherwise they wouldn't be holding the spears. And they're getting involved in these things that look like San trance dances, but they're not San. They're not 100% San trance dances. They're just very heavily influenced by San, the San trance dance. But there's something entirely new and very, very specific to the colonial era. Not only that, but we have parallels, of course, the world over. There are parallels to this kind of thing in Australia. There are parallels to this kind of thing in Southeast Asia. There are parallels in South America, North America. And one of the most famous in North America is the Métis, literally and I imagine your French is much better than mine. The Métis, literally meaning the mixed, that it is the societies on the Canadian, southern Canadian and northern US border still today, who refer to themselves as the mixed because they are very proudly of largely French and Scottish and Native American or First Nations descent. And it's very often these groups who form the vanguard, if you will, of the colonial process. The colonists themselves are very happy to have these waves of people of mixed descent going forth into the hinterland and settling, especially in very, very difficult frontier conditions. And so there's a cynical side to it as well, which is not so nice. And of course, we have parallels with the great horse nations on the plains of North America, etc. The adoption of the horse and the way that it works itself into religious belief, but at the same time, the society becomes incredibly violent, very, very violent frontier conditions. And this is even before any Europeans have actually arrived. So of course, in North America, the horse arrives with the Spanish and makes its way up onto the plains, and you get these horse nations like the Kiowa and the Comanche and Dakota adopting the horse, and they've already had horses for 200 years before any colonists start trekking across. But what happens, of course, is that with the violence in the society, the men are dying and in vast numbers, and so the women are having to step into the ritual sphere. And so we see a parallel in North America where women start to come to the fore in the ritual sphere and take over as ritual specialists. So that's what I think is going on with these sorts of things in North America. Very violent frontier conditions. The rock art changes. It has a narrative feel to it. People start rushing from left to right. They're on horses fighting one another. The rock art changes in that respect, but I would argue there's more to it, and if we can use the parallels from much more recent colonial contexts like South Africa and Australia, we can perhaps read things back into this. I would even suggest that in Valcamonica, we might even be able to propose some slightly more nuanced and slightly more, dare I say it, intricate readings of exactly what's happening with contact and processes of contact. Does it always have to be the indigenous representing the other, or is the rock art being performed by locals who just happen to have adopted these ways, or in a process of adopting new ways, or even as acts of resistance to new ways? Yes, and even today we can see things like the Christian church in Africa being heavily influenced by the ancient hunter-gatherer religions, the incoming pastoralist religions, the incoming African farmer religions, mixing with the European influence over the top. It's just it's a magical rainbow of a religious phenomenon. And I think I'll leave it there.
I think that you made a fantastic presentation, Sam Challis. I thank you very much. You are a wonderful speaker. I have to say that I was very impressed with the precision and clarity of everything that you presented. No, I'm not kind. I'm just sincere. It has been a fantastic journey that you made us do through Southern African rock art, and then I loved also the opening that you made at last with parallels in other parts of the world, because of course it's an interesting process that has many echoes in other parts of the world. Also, the structuring of cultures, it follows often similar patterns. So of course we have both. We have differences and similarities. So it's always interesting to anyway to have a comparison that also enriches the subject that we are studying. It was very interesting. This I have to admit, I didn't remember that there was this sort of Che Guevara war going on in.
Oh yeah.
In the post-contact period. It's very interesting, actually.
Well, a lot of this is the stuff that the apartheid era government, up until 1994, did not want you to know about. They did not want the history up until 1994 was very much one of boxes and people in their place. So these are African farmers over here. The Bushmen were some sort of relic, frozen in time, relic of the past, children of nature, that kind of nonsense. And Europeans were a separate thing, and Indians were a separate thing, and Chinese people were a separate thing. Whereas all along, you know, there was this undeniable undercurrent of cultural and genetic mixing that they didn't like.
Of course, you know how the Romans said. The Romans said, "Divide et impera," so divide all the culture. Don't let them have a historicity, so you can rule upon them. So that's a long-lasting rule for dominating others' culture. I have also to admit that I'm impressed with your the improve of your click sound language pronunciation. That was.
I could be wrong.
No, for me it's very impressive. I have so also it's also always very interesting for mostly for people like. We in Europe, we don't have this. We don't have the habit. I am talking about general culture. In Europe, we don't have the habit of thinking about populations of anthropological populations, that they can have a historicity. Also, this is something that archaeology help us understanding this sort of things, that when we talk about anthropological population, we have there are changes, there is they can meet also something that it's interesting to admit, to understand it, that sometimes anthropological population, we find that the bad people also there. For example, in South America, we have a history of Inca people being the conquerors, so taking upon the lands of other population and making conquest, and with a lot of violence. And the rock art, so the beauty of studying rock art is that we can trace all sort of historical processes, because the world is made by historical processes that it's very difficult, of course, to analyze, considering economics, demography, any sort of influence. So thank you, because you made us do this sort of journey for the area that you know, of course, the best. I have actually a question of my own. You presented a lot of rock art, and many of them representing many things, symbols, the baboons or the shamanic rituals. I wanted to make a simple or not so simple question. What is the status of this rock art for the people realizing this? Is, for example, the shamanic paintings that we see, is it part of the ritual, or is it a representation of something that has happened somewhere else and in a different time?
Oh, do you mean what does it mean to people now, today?
No. When it was done, what is the status of the rock art? Is it representative, or is it part of something happening in that time, in that moment?
I'm quite extreme in my views on that, because I'm I would hesitate to say disciple, but I'm certainly a colleague of Lewis Williams, and I published with him quite a lot. But he's very self-deprecating, and he always says, no, I never said that it was all shamanism. And I would then step in and say, David, no, it is. There is. It would be like going to Europe and seeing a rectangular building in Ireland that was aligned east-west with some colored glass at one end with the window. And saying, yeah, well, it's probably, we don't know what it is. It could be Christian, but it might not be. And you have to hold up your hands and say, no, of course it is. That's exactly what it is. There can't be anything else. It doesn't look anything like any other religion pre-Christianity, and there isn't anything else after that anyway in this part of the world. But you would find the same thing all the way across Europe, and then, of course, after colonization, all the way across much of the rest of the world. Though these things look familiar for a reason. So, rock art in Southern Africa, that depicts strange things, and that is performed. That usually, one of the big giveaways, of course, is that if it's done with a brush, but that's not necessarily the indicator of composite animals and people. You know, almost every single rock art site has some indication, or what we call fragments of the dance. So just one little figure who is in a dancing posture, bending forward like this, bending forward and bleeding from the nose, or with their arms back or their arms out like that. It's an open and shut case. There's no other religious makeup that informs that, except for these mixed cultural groups that you see springing up during contact over the millennia between African groups, and then contact with colonists. You see an inflection or a flavor.
I think that I didn't ask my question clear. It wasn't clear enough, the question. The question was about let's say where the painting is, and at which moment was it painted? I mean,
oh, I see.
Was it near a camp? Was it near a ritual site? Was it done through a journey? Was it done for others to be seen? Was it done? It was really more about the place and the where and at when you painted. Was it the ritual was nearby,
yep.
But also for example, the post. I don't know when they were representing, for example, the women with the big dresses that I think I've seen my own with you live. So was it done when, for which purpose, for whom? That was the question.
Yeah, sorry. I know. I do remember that, and I just didn't. I hadn't answered that part of your question. Sorry. It's very, very difficult for us to know because, of course, for much of the subcontinent, the artists and the people descended from the artists are no longer with us. We have plenty of people of San descent genetically and also partially culturally who have become part of these larger, meta categories of African farmer society. We don't have very many, if any, culturally extant San people in the southeastern mountains, where most of the rock art that we're referring to is now. All of the living San, or who call themselves Bushmen, are now in the Kalahari or in the very far north of South Africa, like the Khomani San, who are largely Afrikaans speaking now. So they only now speak the language of the colonial oppressor, having lost their language or having their language removed from them, whether by law or by other means. So it's very difficult to pick up the pieces, these traces of exactly what the sites were used for. But one very, very easy indication is the way in which the rock art interacts with the rock face itself. Mm-hmm. The rock face is not a neutral support for the paintings. Mm-hmm. It is part of it. It is part of it. So you see antelope disappearing into cracks in the rock. Mm-hmm. You see eland emerging from cracks in the rock like this, walking out from behind the rock. And then you see
cave art. We have the same in cave art.
Absolutely, it's something that's and you know, Lewis Williams has pointed this out for Paleolithic France and Spain and Europe, much to his annoyance, you know, because it wasn't very popular. And of course, Jean-Claude picked it up immediately and said, "Oui, that's absolutely what's going on." Yeah, not that anyone suggested that they were in any way culturally connected. I think that's the big mistake that people make. Is no. It's something that occurs neurologically. That anyway, that's for another day.
Yeah, of course.
But absolutely. So then you know that you're in a ritual space. You're in a space whereby, because all of these images are visions of the spirit world, visions of this other place, or at least interactions with the spirit world. So for San speakers, it's very difficult to you can't differentiate between. There's no such thing as real life and the spirit world. There are other places that you can travel to where the spirits live, or the spirits are, and very often the spirits will come to you and make themselves visible to you in what we would call the real world. But there's very little differentiation. The interaction with the spirits and other non-human beings, non-human persons, is everyday life. So you know, it's difficult. You can't really speak in terms of everyday life for the San. Everyday life is a spiritual
event. Yeah.
A spiritual event, but there are more punctuated events, and there are places that are more punctuated. And so you can have living spaces. So you go into a rock shelter, and there's a lot of archaeology on the ground, and you go in and you pick up stone tools and artifacts, and you say, okay, here, this one is a living site, and therefore the paintings are just a decoration, like my paintings on the wall there. It's just decoration because this is a living site. No. You know, it's very difficult because we have a formal separation between the sacred and the profane. It's hard for us to get outside of our own heads and imagine somebody sitting on the floor in the Vatican making a sandwich. You know, these guys are living. They're living in their most sacred spot, and it's all about relationships with animals or other beings, and relationships with deities that can or that may or may not happen at any given moment in time. I don't know if that helps.
Yes, it definitely. So I have a short question. So why, at least in the first images that you have shown, the shamans are all evidently male? because of epiphallic representation, I guess. Why they were all males? That's the question.
It's something that that scholars are still struggling with. We haven't really put our finger on exactly why that may be. There is an enormous preponderance towards male figures in the traditional corpus, at least. Hence, why we were able to then see in the 19th century stuff. Hey, now women are appearing in this 19th century rock art. It's not to say that women are absent entirely. There's just very many more men. It seems as if there's anything that's formalized in San ritual practice, it's the great healing dances. And if the Kalahari is indeed anything to go by, because this is of course contested as to whether the Kalahari material is indeed relevant in the South, which it overwhelmingly can be proven to be relevant, then it's the job of the women to clap and to sing, to project and summon the essence of the animals by singing the animals. So if the healing song is giraffe, what you're actually doing is you're summoning the essence of the giraffe to that place. So it's hard to get our heads around this concept that it's not a song about a giraffe. The song is the animal. So if you're singing giraffe, what you're doing is you're bringing it to that place, to the fire. And so the women are clapping and they're singing the giraffe song, which in itself is incredibly important. And the men are dancing around this seated group. And it is their job to absorb the essence, the spirit, the essence of this, and the potency, the power of this animal that is now being summoned. It's now here, it's all around us, and we have to absorb it into our bodies. And only with that power can we catapult or project ourselves into the spirit world. Now, the men, this is routine. This happens. This can happen twice a week or once every week. This healing dance, but it's not to say that women don't do it. So women will sing and clap, and then sometimes get up and join the dance, and sometimes fall into the unconsciousness as well. And I've seen this in the Kalahari myself. And it's something that's on the increase now today. But women access the spirit world in different ways. So very commonly in the Kalahari, 2/3 of all men and 1/3 of all women will at some point try to become healers in their lives. So that's a high percentage compared to yours and my lives. That's a very, very high percentage of people who wishing to become specialists in ritual. And most of them drop out of the training because it's very, very difficult and it's very taxing. It's very emotionally draining and physically draining, and it's very frightening because of the things that you see on the other side. So but women normally access the spirit world through dreams. This is I'm talking about the Kalahari now, and it may just be a function of the fact that the accessing of the spirit world through dreams, for some reason or other in society, did not then translate into paint, whereas the accessing of the spirit world from the healing dances by the male dancers was somehow something that was then ritually transposed onto the rock face for whatever reason. Unfortunately, we don't have access to the exact reasons why, but there does seem to be there are shifts. There's a sort of gendered change and flux through time, and various later Stone Age archaeologists, Lynn Wadley, Aaron Maisel, they have attempted to understand the gendered past by looking at the material culture. But it's a very, very difficult thing to determine. You know, things like women's industries, like the making of beads and the symbolism behind these beads made from the ostrich eggshell, and gendered spaces in the rock shelters, particularly these hunter-gatherer habitation, occupation spaces, through time, through going through the archaeological record. One of Aaron Mazel's greatest findings, I think, was the increase of woodworking tools that may, in fact, show at a particular point in time an increase in female concerns, or at least female control over the making of wooden items of material culture. And so we can see a back and forth. And so I think possibly at times we may even have had fluctuations in the painted record that we can't determine, because our archaeological record is, the superpositioning is very, very difficult to determine. We can see certain animals becoming more prominent and then fading from prominence through time. So there's an introduction of, for example, smaller antelope like raybuck come in at a certain time and then go away again. And of course, we have huge regional variation as well. So if you go up to Zimbabwe, there's a whole different suite of animals. But you still have dancers bending forward and bleeding from the nose. So there are many things that we can say based on our ethnographic archive, but there's still a lot that we have to just stand back and say, no, I don't know the answer to that yet, but we're slowly making our way towards it.
Of course. If we had all the answers, we wouldn't be here, actually.
It's true.
So thanks to the great amount of things that we still have to discover, and that makes archaeology very interesting, actually, in my opinion. So there is somebody, I don't know if it's somebody that you know, because he says, hi, Sam. It's Menaxi Patak. We don't know. So he asks if is this the populations, the sun or the population making rock art connected to sacrality, to some rituals? Are these places are they still worshipping those sacred sites? Because, for example, parentheses, as you quoted North America, so I was living in Canada for several years. There are some places there that are still, where still people go and where they bring offerings. So there are still some places that still has a sacred value. Of course, that changes. It's not the same nature of what it has been in the past, but sacrality changes. Also, you quote a lot of Christianity. Christianity itself changed a lot of the way of being Christian through time. So,
yeah, it's a very interesting question, and I presume if if you're not resident here in this subcontinent, it's not something that's necessarily very obvious, and it's also something that the apartheid regime did not want to have broadcast, or even the colonial British regime that preceded it, and that is that there was this San hunter-gatherer genocide that started in the 1600s and continued slowly but surely all the way through until essentially the present day. And the scholars like Robert Gordon talking about the Kalahari in Botswana, Namibia, where it carried on even into the 20th century. And we have equivalents, of course, in Australia with people shooting Aboriginals and, for sport and disgusting things like that. But this,
sorry, I make a parenthesis. You know, we have Ernesto De Martino in Italy, which is an Italian anthropologist, that was studying some, how do you say, when you have been inhabited by the possession rituals made in Italy until the 70s. Okay.
Right. Yes.
It's recorded on video, interviews. It's recorded. So we have possession rituals in Italy until the 70s.
Oh yes, absolutely. All the world's major religions have some form of ecstatic, and Christianity. The very different subdivisions of Christianity very often have ecstatic qualities, and Islam has the whirling dervishes in Turkey and all of that sort of thing.
Well, this one that he studied, it has an African origin because it's not real Christian. It's about a tarantula. So
yes, the tarantula. Yes,
a spider.
Yes.
Spider that is biting, and so the spirit of the spider is supposed to inhabit you. So it's not really Christians. The historicity of this, they think it's coming from the south. It was in south of Italy.
Oh yes, yeah. Southern Spain particularly. No, but my point was that the extant San today are largely living in the Kalahari, and the Kalahari is famously a stoneless desert. There are no mountains or even rocks on which to engrave. So even when you get into the arid regions of southern Africa, there are many boulders and rocks on which we have engravings, which I haven't even spoken about today. Many thousands and thousands of engravings, also of different genres and associated with different sorts of people. But in the Kalahari, even when you have grasses and trees, there are no rocks at all. And so the people who live there, the Jutransi, the Quay, the Naron, all of these different language groups. And by the way, these are the oldest languages on Earth, and a lot of them are mutually they neighbor one another, and they're mutually unintelligible.
I've seen a study recently that it has been studied that the Sun is one of the oldest language, right?
Oh yes, absolutely.
I've seen something recently.
And we and you and I and our audience, whether they're in France or Japan, all share aspects of our genetic heritage with the San. All of us, we all share DNA with San people. But they don't have a tradition of making rock art themselves, and so they have their sacred landscapes, waterholes and features on their landscapes, where all sorts which are associated with things ritual, and again, their daily life is one and the same thing with their spiritual life. They don't divide the sacred and the profane. So everything is a religious experience
of power.
If you're walking through a river and you're up to here in the water, your feet are in the spirit world. I mean, it's as simple as that. But the closest paintings to the Jutransi, who live in northern Botswana on the border with Namibia, are at the Tsodilo Hills, which is a very famous rock art. It's a World Heritage Site, rock art World Heritage Site. And of the Tsodilo Hills, when asked, the local, the nearby San said, no, we didn't make those paintings. There's nothing to do with us. God put them there. Now, what that exactly means is a very interesting thing. It was taken at face value. God put them there. And so the scholars just thought, well, they don't know about them, but maybe just saying that God put the rock art there, that might have a lot of meaning in itself. I mean, indigenous Australians are famous for saying that they didn't make the paintings even while making the painting. They'd be making a painting of a kangaroo, saying, "I'm not doing this." It was there already, So we want that. It's a warning to be very, very careful about how to treat the ethnographic sources as well. So there's another, so that's one half of my answer to that one. The other half would be that, for instance, in today's Lesotho, in the Maluti Drakensberg, there are plenty of different language groups and cultures who claim San descent. And they're African farmer ancestral praise poetry. So you sing the praises of your clan ancestors going back through the generations. Many of them have, for example, Batwa. So the Batwa is the Nguni name for the hunter-gatherers, for the San, Abatwa. And so they will go through the clans, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, going back in time, and then there will be Abatwa in there, included in your family tree. So it's a known entity that at certain points in time, and it can be different from one clan to the next, the hunter-gatherer, the Abatwa, were part of it and incorporated. And it's another way that where we can demonstrate, look, the San are not, they haven't vanished, they're not dead and gone. Although we have to be, of course, very careful about that, owing to the dreadful genocide that had taken place the preceding 200 years. But it's very nice for us as anthropologists to be able to speak to farmer groups, particularly the today's ritual specialists, many of whom still have this very rich tradition, much of which comes from San medicinal practice and spiritual practice, and derive fascinating answers in our interviews with these guys. Not necessarily about the paintings. Now, there's also another, if I may, another very interesting connection with the paintings, where modern traditional healers will remove paint from the paintings because of the connection between themselves and their San ancestors. And so it's believed that because the paintings themselves are powerful, and we believe that the San themselves thought of the paintings as being powerful because they're full of powerful things like a magical medicinal plant ingredients and the animal blood and fat, very powerful magical medicinal substances that the paint was actually made from, that modern healers will go to the paintings and remove and scratch and take paint to use in their medicines that they will then administer to their community. Now,
I remember that. Yeah, I remember that.
Yeah. Now, you know, it's not for me to go charging in there and say, "Hey, stop this! You're destroying the painting." So it's a very tricky one, and it's a very interesting conversation, because it could even be, you know, perhaps one of the last true connections between these healers who have San descent and the paintings themselves. Yeah. But at the same time, we do often find ourselves having to say, look, you know, if once they're gone, they're gone. They won't be there anymore if they're completely removed.
That's actually a very interesting example of still worshipping a sacred place. I think that we have answered all the questions that we had for today. I mean, for today, questions that you had and that the public had. So our friend Meenakshi was also remembering that also in India there are many examples of composite animals and shamanic stories in rock art, but we have a lot of examples for this kind of rock art. I would like to thank you with very warmly, can you say very warmly, our friend, my friend Sam Challis. I'm very glad that he accepted to participate in our conference series, Parlando di arte rupestre. It was very interesting. It was a pleasure to to hear from you. After some years, we didn't talk directly. So it has been a very interesting presentation that will still remain on Facebook, and we will upload it on YouTube very soon. So you can also share the link if you like. So thank you. Have a good evening at the other parallel of the world, in the other season of the world, and hope to see you soon.
You're too kind. That's very kind, and thank you very, very much for the opportunity.
It has been a great pleasure.
Grazie mille.
A great pleasure.